£1 million. That is the new line the government has drawn through the middle of British farming. Not a fine, not a fee, a threshold. And if a farm is worth more than that when the owner dies, the next generation now owes the taxman a bill many of them cannot pay without selling the land itself. Jeremy Clarkson's farm crosses that line several times over. Here is the thing nobody in Westminster wants to say out loud. This was never really a tax on wealthy landowners. It was a tax on machinery, soil, and sheds that happened to carry a paper value nobody can spend. And Steve Barclay never saw how badly that distinction would come back to bite him. Clarkson bought Diddly Squat for £6 million back in 2008, a struggling patch of Oxfordshire farmland nobody else wanted. He built it, slowly and expensively, into something worth many times that: a working farm, a restaurant, a shop, and a brewery called Hawkstone that alone is now valued in the tens of millions. On paper, that is a triumph. Under the new inheritance rules, that success is exactly what makes it vulnerable. Jeremy Clarkson never set out to be a farming policy case study. He inherited a love of the countryside from a mother who ran a Cotswolds gift shop, and he spent the first 50 years of his life mocking farmers on television before he ever became one himself. That matters here, because it means he came into this world as an outsider who had to learn, in public, on camera, exactly how thin the margins really are. Every mistake he made in those early seasons, the collapsed barn, the failed rapeseed crop, the £444 profit on a farm that cost $6 million to buy, was a lesson the rest of the country got to watch for free. It also means nobody can accuse him of romanticizing this. He has shown, receipt by receipt, exactly how brutal the numbers already were before this tax ever existed. And this is the part worth pausing on. Everything he built afterward, the shop, the restaurant, the brewery, was not a rich man's hobby farm expanding for fun. It was survival. Diversification because the actual farming, the wheat and the barley, barely covered its own costs. Hawkstone exists because the land alone could not pay the bills. Ask yourself what that means for every smaller farm that never had a television deal to fall back on. Hold that thought, because the number gets worse the closer you look at it. Here is what changes on the 1st of April 2026. Agricultural property relief, the rule that has let farms pass from parent to child for generations without a crushing tax bill, gets capped. The first £1 million of combined farm and business value is still protected. Above that, families face a 20% tax on the rest. Steve Barclay stood in front of the committee and called it a fair adjustment. Only the wealthiest estates, he said, would ever feel it. He had the calm voice of a man who has never had to sell a barn to pay a bill. And for a moment, the room nodded along, because the number sounded small, and the word wealthy sounded like someone else's problem. That was the version everyone believed. Here is what the paperwork actually showed. A modest working farm today, land, a couple of tractors, some livestock, a barn or two, can easily be valued at £3 or £4 million. Not because the farmer is rich, because land prices climbed while farm incomes stayed almost flat. The NFU has been blunt about this. Their own analysis suggests a significant share of genuine working farms sit above that £1 million line, not the handful of super estates the policy claims to target. Every farmer who has ever watched a good year get swallowed by a bad one knows that story. Not the version where farming is a hobby for the wealthy. The real one, where the land is worth a fortune and the bank account is not. Now think about what that actually means for a family. A farm worth £3 million, no spare cash sitting around, because farms run on debt and thin margins, not savings. The parent dies. Within months, the family owes a six-figure tax bill on an asset they cannot easily turn into cash. There is only one place that money can come from: the land itself, not shares, not some tidy pension pot. The actual fields, the actual barns, the exact thing the whole business depends on to survive. And once land starts moving under that kind of pressure, ask yourself who is actually in a position to buy it. Picture it in Hawkstone's terms for a second, because the brewery makes the trap easier to see. Hawkstone does not just need a name and a recipe. It needs barley grown on that specific land, storage in those specific barns, and a supply chain that only works because the farm, the brewery, and the shop all sit on the same books. Sell off 200 acres to cover a tax bill, and you are not simply losing scenery. You are cutting into the ingredient supply of a business already stocked in thousands of pubs across the country. The debt does not stay in one corner of the balance sheet. It pulls at every part of it at once. Not the next generation of farmers trying to get started. They cannot compete with cash buyers. It is investment funds. It is corporate landlords. It is people who see farmland as a tax-efficient asset, not a food source. The very policy sold as closing a loophole for the wealthy ends up delivering British farmland into fewer, richer hands, just through the back door instead of the front. Steve Barclay built a policy to stop the rich from hoarding farmland. He may end up handing them more of it than they had before. But here is where it gets stranger, because Barclay's own defense made things worse, not better. He pointed to spousal exemptions, said most families would not face the bill immediately because it transfers tax-free to a surviving partner first. True, but ask the obvious follow-up question, the one nobody at the table wanted to answer. What happens on the second death? When that surviving spouse eventually passes the farm to the children, the entire value hits the tax bill at once. No second buffer, no second chance to plan around it. Read that again. The relief everyone was reassured by only delays the problem by one generation. It does not remove it. This is where the story stops being about one farm in Oxfordshire and starts being about every farm you have ever driven past on a Sunday. By the time this story is finished, the number you started with, that £1 million threshold, will look nothing like the modest little safeguard it was sold as. It will look like the trigger for one of the biggest shifts in farmland ownership Britain has seen in decades, and almost nobody outside the farming community has noticed it is happening. Think about the maths for a moment, because the maths is the whole argument. The government values a hectare of rewilded land at £700 a year in support payments. But a hectare of genuinely productive farmland, properly worked, generates somewhere between £2,000 and £3,000 of real economic output every single year. So the country is simultaneously underpaying farmers to leave land idle and overtaxing them for owning land that actually produces food. It is squeezing British farming from both directions at once and calling it balance. Every farmer who has ever tried to explain their finances to a banker who has never set foot on a farm knows this feeling. The numbers on paper and the cash in the account are two completely different stories, and policy keeps getting written for the paper version. Now, here is the part that even people who follow this story closely have never fully joined up. Britain already imports around 45% of the food it eats. If a tax policy accelerates the sale of working farms into land that is rewilded, leased out, or simply mothballed while an estate gets sorted, domestic food production does not hold steady. It shrinks further. And that gap does not disappear. It gets filled by imports, grown under regulations, welfare standards, and environmental rules that Britain does not control and cannot inspect. Steve Barclay wanted his legacy to be fairness for ordinary taxpayers. What he may actually be remembered for is quietly making the country less able to feed itself. Compare that to how other countries treat the same problem. France protects agricultural succession with dedicated relief schemes precisely because it does not want farmland fragmenting under tax pressure. Germany does something similar, treating working farms as a category worth shielding, not a loophole worth closing. Britain, meanwhile, is one of the only major economies quietly making it harder for a farm to survive the death of the person running it. That is not a technical detail. That is a choice about what kind of country this wants to be. For now, picture what this looks like from inside a farmhouse kitchen, not a committee room. A family that has worked the same fields for 3 generations, that has never taken a foreign holiday because every spare pound went back into machinery and seed, suddenly facing a tax bill bigger than most people's mortgages on an asset they cannot sell in pieces without destroying the business it supports. That is not a wealthy landowner being asked to contribute a little more. That is a working family being asked to gamble their entire livelihood on a valuation nobody agreed they were rich because of. What this country used to stand for was simple. Farmers fed the nation, and in return, the nation made sure that work could be passed down. That deal is quietly being rewritten, one budget line at a time, and most people will not notice until the shelves start to show it. There is a quiet irony sitting underneath all of this that is worth sitting with for a second. Steve Barclay's own explanation leaned on the word fairness again and again. Fair to taxpayers, fair to future generations. But fairness that forces a working family to sell the tools of their own survival to satisfy a tax bill on wealth they cannot spend is not fairness. It is a transfer from people who grow food to people who trade land, dressed up in the language of balance. That single decision, buried in a budget most people scrolled past, would end up costing more than anyone in that room seemed willing to admit. Wait. Before we close this out, sit with one more number, because it is the one that should worry you most. Britain currently produces around 60% of the food it consumes. If working farms keep exiting production at pace, industry voices warn that figure could slide lower within a decade. That is not a distant, abstract risk. That is a country becoming steadily more dependent on the same volatile global supply chains that broke down during recent shocks, at exactly the moment those chains are proving least reliable. So here is the honest question this whole story keeps circling back to, and it is not really about Jeremy Clarkson at all. If Britain keeps writing policy that makes farmland easier to sell than to inherit, who exactly is supposed to be farming this country in 20 years, and who is going to own the land instead? That question does not have a comfortable answer yet, which is exactly why it deserves one. You cannot inherit trust with the land. You can only earn it, generation after generation, and then hope the law doesn't take it from you. If this story changed how you think about where your food actually comes from, that is the whole point of telling it. So tell me honestly in the comments, should family farms get full protection from this tax, no matter their paper value, or does the government have a fair point somewhere in here that farmers aren't willing to admit? I read every answer, and I want the real one, not the polite one.